The chill off the Danube was a physical entity, a damp, silent predator that hunted the narrow cobblestone alleys of Vienna's Innere It had teeth of wind that gnawed at the exposed skin on Victor's wrists and neck, where the collar of his coat and the cuffs of his gloves failed to meet. It seeped through the thick, dark wool of his overcoat like a creeping stain of mortality, a tangible cold that felt less like a temperature and more like an omen. He could taste it on the back of his tongue, a metallic tang of old stone, river water, the exhaust from a distant Trabant, and the ghosts of empires that had risen and crumbled on these very streets. It was a constant, unwelcome reminder that he was a foreign body in this city of waltzes and whispers, a sliver of Siberian ice in a cup of Viennese coffee. He sat at a small, wrought-iron table outside the Café Corbe, a ghost hiding in plain sight, his hands wrapped around a porcelain cup that had surrendered its warmth an hour ago. The coffee within was a black, bitter sludge. He didn't mind. Warmth was a comfort, and comfort was a weakness his profession did not permit. His eyes, the color of wet slate on a winter morning, never strayed from the man seated by the plate-glass window inside. Anatoly Levin, the target. Levin was a creature of habit, a theoretical physicist turned dissident whose routines were as predictable and immutable as the laws of thermodynamics he once taught at Moscow State University. Every Tuesday and Friday, at precisely 4 o'clock in the afternoon, he would arrive at the Café Corbe, nod to the waiter who knew him by sight, and take this same corner table. He would order a single melange with an extra cube of sugar, and then unfold the Neue Zürcher Zeitung. He held the crisp, broadsheet pages up like a shield, a fragile barrier of ink and paper against a world he no longer trusted. To the casual observer, the students hurrying past with their satchels stuffed with books, the tourists with their cameras aimed at the Baroque facades, the businessmen discussing mergers over strudel, he was just another aging émigré, a man lost in thought, his face etched with the quiet, permanent sorrow of the displaced. But Victor was not a casual observer. Victor was a student of human frailty, a connoisseur of the minute tells that betrayed the turmoil beneath a placid surface. His training at the KGB's Balashikha Special Operations School had not been about politics. It had been about the deconstruction of the human animal. He saw the frayed edges of the man's composure, the almost imperceptible tick that fluttered in his left eyelid when a police siren wailed in the distance, a sound too close to the wail of a chaika from the 9th Directorate. He saw the way Levin's hand, speckled with the liver spots of his 63 years, trembled slightly as he lifted his cup, causing a tiny, perfect crescent of coffee to slosh onto the saucer. He saw the way Levin's eyes, even when focused on an article about Swiss banking regulations, would dart towards the door every time it opened, a reflexive, animalistic check for a threat he couldn't see, but could always feel. Levin was a man running on borrowed time, and the debt, with compounded interest, was about to be called in. Victor's code name was Granite. Granite. It suited him. It was the name given to him by his first training officer, a man who had seen the boy carved from the harsh, unforgiving realities of the Caucasus and recognized a material that would not crack under pressure. Polished into a merciless instrument by the first chief directorate of the KGB, Victor was not a man of ideology. He considered ideology a luxury for academics and politicians, a comforting story they told themselves to justify the necessary brutality of the world. He was a man of mechanics, of physics in its most brutal application. He understood pressure points, leverage, the precise application of force, and the inevitable point of structural failure in any system, be it a bridge, a government, or a man. and Anatoly Levin was a fulcrum upon which the balance of a very dangerous game was teetering. Levin's crime was not espionage in the traditional, clumsy sense. He didn't sell secrets or photograph military installations from moving trains. His weapon was far more insidious, far more elegant. A manuscript, a samizdat masterpiece of horrifying clarity titled The Red Labyrinth. It was not a political polemic filled with tired rhetoric. It was a meticulous, philosophical, and deeply personal vivisection of the Soviet state. Not as a political entity, but as a psychological prison. With the cold precision of a physicist mapping a quantum field, Levin detailed the slow, grinding erosion of the human soul under the relentless weight of the party. He described the doublethink that became breath, the institutionalized paranoia that replaced blood in the veins of a nation, the way language itself was warped until words like freedom and truth became their own opposites. A passage from the single chapter Victor had been allowed to read in his sterile briefing room in Yasenevo still echoed in his mind, a fragment of hostile code that his own mental firewalls couldn't quite purge. The state is not a wall that surrounds us, Levin had written. It is a mirror we are forced to hold up, in which we must see only the party's reflection after a lifetime of this. We forget our own faces. It was more dangerous than 100 stolen blueprints for a new class of submarine, because it was a truth that, if it ever saw the light of day in the West, would arm the enemy with a moral certainty they hadn't possessed since the early days of the Cold War. It would validate every piece of their propaganda. The manuscript was the package. Levin was merely the container. He had smuggled one copy out, a microfilmed version now nestled in a climate-controlled safe at a prestigious publishing house in London, awaiting his final, signed approval for publication. That approval would never come. The directive from Moscow Center, delivered by a man known only as the Colonel in a smoke-filled room that smelled of old paper and quiet menace, had been unequivocal. Both the author and his work were to be returned, not eliminated. Returned. An elimination was simple, almost elegant. A fall from a bridge over the Donau Canal, a tragic gas leak in a poorly maintained apartment, a mugging gone wrong in the Prater. Vienna was full of such unfortunate, easily arranged accidents. But a return was a message. It was a brutal, theatrical declaration, broadcast on a frequency only their enemies and their own straying lambs could hear, that the state's reach was absolute. There was no asylum, no sanctuary. The leash was long, but it was forged from unbreakable steel. Victor drained the cold, bitter dregs of his coffee, the taste of ashes on his tongue. He glanced at his watch, a simple military-issue Vostok amphibia. 1647. It was time. He reached into his coat pocket, his fingers brushing against the cold, smooth plastic of a small, single earpiece receiver. He pressed it into his ear canal, a perfect, snug fit. A faint hiss of static resolved into the sound of calm, rhythmic breathing. Pavel, the driver and technician, ever the professional, was ready. The signal. He picked up his spoon and tapped it twice against the saucer. The sharp, metallic clink-clink was a sound utterly insignificant to anyone else on the street, lost in the urban symphony of tram bells and chatter. But for his team, it was the firing pin striking the primer. He followed it with a single, longer scrape of the spoon against the porcelain, a sound like a nail being dragged across a tombstone. Target is mobile. Initiate Phase 2. Across the street, leaning against the rain-streaked window of a bookstore and pretending to read a newspaper, a burly man in a drab raincoat, Dmitri, straightened up. Dmitri was a block of Soviet concrete, a veteran of the bloody fiasco in Afghanistan, whose quiet demeanor hid a capacity for sudden, shocking violence. He folded his paper with practiced slowness, tucked it under his arm, and began a deliberate walk down the lane, his heavy gait eating up the cobblestones. In a parked Mercedes W123, a dark blue diplomatic vehicle with a dull gleam of state-sanctioned anonymity, Pavel would be running through his final systems check, his fingers flying over a custom-built console hidden beneath the passenger seat. Victor could almost hear him muttering to himself, checking the encrypted shortwave frequency, 4.625 megahertz, the buzzer channel, silent now, but ready, and ensuring the vehicle's modifications were armed. Every component of the machine was now in motion. Inside the cafe, Levin folded his newspaper with the meticulous care of a librarian, placing a few shilling coins on the table before rising. He pulled on his worn tweed coat, a garment that seemed to carry the weight of his exile in its very threads, and stepped out into the biting Viennese air. The dance had begun. Victor remained seated, a statue of casual indifference. He was the conductor. His work was best done from the podium, observing the symphony of controlled violence he had composed. He watched as Levin began his customary walk home, a 20-minute journey through a labyrinth of side streets and quiet squares that Victor and his team had mapped, timed, and rehearsed for 3 weeks. This was the kill zone. Not a zone of death, but of transition. A place where Anatoly Levin, free man and intellectual, would cease to exist, and package Epsilon would be acquired for transport. Dmitri, the hammer, was now 50 meters ahead of Levin, seemingly examining the antique clocks in a dusty shop window. His role was simple: to be an obstacle, a point of friction, the first domino. Levin followed his predictable path, turning into the Current Gasse, a narrow canyon of Baroque facades that amplified the mournful cry of the wind. As he neared the corner, a woman, one of theirs, a local asset named Elka, a disillusioned university student whose curdled idealism made her pliable, paid in cash and promises, would accidentally drop her string bag of groceries. It was a classic, almost cliché misdirection. The lost tourist gambit. Its very simplicity was its strength. People expect spies to use laser beams and car bombs, not rolling apples. Levin, a fundamentally decent man whose kindness had not yet been fully extinguished by years of state persecution, would stop to help. In that moment of distracted, reflexive chivalry, his guard would be at its absolute lowest. Victor watched the scene unfold from the mouth of the alley, his position calculated for a perfect line of sight and a swift approach. Elke stumbled, as if catching her heel on a loose stone. The string bag fell. Red apples and a tube of lipstick rolled and scattered across the dark, wet cobblestones, like drops of blood. Levin, as predicted, bent to help, his knees creaking. It was almost pitiful. Verzeihung, Elke murmured, her voice laced with practiced distress. Oh my goodness. Kein problem, Levin replied, his German accented but gentle. Let me help you. As he knelt, his focus entirely on an apple rolling toward a drain, Dmitri rounded the corner behind him. He moved with the chilling economy of motion that Victor had only ever seen in elite soldiers. His large frame glided silently over the stones, displacing no air. At precisely the same moment, Pavel swung the dark blue Mercedes into the mouth of the alley, its engine a low, hungry purr that was swallowed by the wind. The passenger side doors opened before the car had even come to a complete stop. Dark invitations to a journey with no return ticket. Victor moved now, his own part to play. He approached Levin from the front, his face a mask of polite civic concern. "Is everything all right here?" he asked in flawless, colloquial German. Levin looked up, his eyes meeting Victor's. For a fleeting microsecond, the physicist's razor-sharp intellect registered the anomaly. The stumbling woman, the large man appearing from nowhere, this third man's sudden arrival, the waiting car. It was a configuration of too many coincidences, a violation of the laws of probability. A cascade of horrifying calculations flashed behind his eye. He saw the equation of his own doom being solved in real time. His eyes widened, not with simple fear, but with the dawning intellectual horror of a solved proof. It was too late. Dmitri's massive, calloused hand clamped over Levin's mouth, the palm swallowing his nose and jaw, stifling the cry before it could form. His other arm, thick as a bridge cable, wrapped around Levin's chest, lifting him off his feet as if he were a child. Levin struggled, a desperate thrashing surge of adrenaline. But it was like a fish fighting a bear. It was a biological reflex, nothing more. Victor stepped in close, his movements precise and cold. He held a small, discreet object in his hand, what looked like an elegant, matte black fountain pen. It was a Directorate T device, codenamed the Kiss. He pressed the tip against the soft flesh of Levin's neck, just below the earlobe in the carotid triangle. There was a faint hiss, a sound almost inaudible over the wind, like a sigh. The needle, finer than a human hair and propelled by compressed gas, delivered its payload, a potent derivative of carfentanil, mixed with a fast-acting paralytic succinylcholine. It was designed not to render the subject unconscious immediately, but to create a wave of profound disorientation and catastrophic muscle failure within seconds. Consciousness would linger for another minute, a minute of pure, helpless terror, a silent scream in a paralyzed body. Levin's struggles ceased instantly. His body went slack, a dead weight in Dmitri's arms. His eyes rolled back in his head, showing the whites. The fight was over. Together, Dmitri and Victor bundled the limp form into the back of the Mercedes. Elka scooped up her apples, gave a curt, professional nod, and vanished into the pedestrian flow of the main street. The entire event, from the dropped bag to the soft click of the car door, had taken less than 12 seconds. The Kurrentgasse was empty again, save for a single forgotten red apple resting by a drain pipe, a tiny, vibrant splash of color in the monochrome alley. Inside the car, the air was thick with the scent of adrenaline, damp wool, and the cheap pine tree air freshener dangling from the rearview mirror. Pavel didn't look back, his hands steady on the wheel as he pulled smoothly into traffic. Just another diplomatic vehicle navigating the evening rush hour towards the Gürtel Ring Road. Dmitri sat beside the slumped form of Levin, his hand resting lightly on the physicist's shoulder, ready to apply brute force if the drugs didn't hold. Victor got to work. He produced a medical kit from a hidden compartment in the door panel. First, a gag, not a crude strip of cloth, but a soft, medical-grade polymer restraint that fit securely inside the mouth, depressing the tongue to prevent any possibility of swallowing it or making a sound, while still allowing for labored breathing through the nasal passages. Then, blackout goggles and noise-canceling earmuffs. Sensory deprivation was a key component of subject transport. A man who cannot see or hear is a man untethered from reality, easier to control, easier to break long before he reaches his destination. He felt for Levin's pulse at the wrist. It was thready but stable. The dosage was correct. The colonel in Moscow, the architect of this operation, had been pathologically insistent. A live, physically undamaged package. The mind was theirs to shatter later, in the soundproofed rooms of the Lubyanka. The body was merely the delivery vessel. They drove south, away from the glittering city center, towards the sprawling, anonymous industrial parks that bordered the Wienerwald. Here, in the anonymity of a rented warehouse that smelled of rust, diesel, and stale oil, the second phase would begin. Pavel backed the Mercedes into the cavernous space, hitting a remote that sent the heavy corrugated steel door groaning shut behind them, sealing them in darkness until the harsh, buzzing fluorescent lights flickered on one by one. The centerpiece of the warehouse was not the Mercedes, but a second vehicle, a Lada 2105. It was a pathetic car by Western standards, a boxy utilitarian symbol of Soviet engineering at its most joyless. But this one was special. It was Pavel's masterpiece. "Is he stable, Granite?" Pavel asked, his voice tight with a mixture of professional pride and anxiety. He was an artist from Directorate T, and this was his gallery opening. "He is stable," Victor confirmed, pulling Levin's inert form out of the Mercedes. Dmitri slung the man over his shoulder like a sack of grain and carried him towards the Lada. Pavel approached the Lada's rear. "Open," he commanded, to no one in particular. He pressed a sequence of buttons on a small remote. The trunk lid didn't pop open. It rose smoothly and silently on custom-fitted pneumatic struts. The trunk was not a trunk. It was a high-tech tomb. The entire space had been stripped to bare metal and then painstakingly rebuilt. It was lined with a thick, dense layer of sound-absorbing acoustic foam, which was in turn covered by a custom-molded fiberglass and Kevlar shell that fit snugly within the metal frame, leaving no gaps, no hard edges. A series of thick leather straps with quick-release buckles were bolted directly to the car's chassis. But the true genius was in the life support system. Pavel pointed with a greasy but delicate finger. "Air intake here," he said, indicating a small, filtered vent connected by a flexible hose to a hidden scoop under the car's rear bumper. "It feeds into a closed-loop rebreather system, a small oxygen canister, medical grade, good for 72 hours, and a carbon dioxide scrubber, military spec. It's completely silent, no exhaust." He then indicated a series of thin, color-coded medical tubes. "This one is for hydration, saline drip with electrolytes. This one for sedation. Connects to an IV port we will insert. And this one," he tapped a wider tube leading to a sealed collection bag, "is for waste. We keep the package clean, no complications." Finally, he pointed to a small metallic sensor pad on the floor of the compartment. "Heart rate, respiration, and core body temperature. The data feeds via a hard line to this." He held up a small handheld monitor with a simple LCD screen. "I will know if he is in distress before he does." It is a perfect system. It was a marvel of brutal ingenuity. A mobile isolation chamber designed for one purpose: to transport a human being across half of Europe like a piece of classified cargo. His entire biological existence reduced to a few numbers on a screen. Victor nodded, his face impassive. "Prepare the package." They laid Levin on a clean plastic tarp. Victor, with the detached precision of a field medic, stripped him of his tweed coat, his trousers, his worn leather shoes, replacing them with a simple, loose-fitting cotton jumpsuit. He found the cephalic vein in Levin's arm on the first try and expertly inserted an IV catheter, taping it down securely. Dmitri strapped a harness around Levin's chest, to which the biometric sensors were attached. Then they lifted him and placed him inside the trunk. The space was so perfectly conformed to a human shape that he fit with only inches to spare. Dmitri began securing the straps, pulling them tight enough to prevent any movement, but not so tight as to restrict circulation. Levin was on his back, his knees slightly bent, his arms secured at his sides. He was a man being nailed into his own coffin. As Victor connected the IV lines and the waste tube, Levin's eyelids fluttered. A low guttural moan escaped past the gag. His powerful mind was fighting its way out of the chemical fog. For a moment, his eyes, wide with uncomprehending terror, locked with Victor's. In that gaze, Victor saw not a dissident or a traitor, but a man, a husband, a father, an intellectual giant, stripped of all dignity and facing an unimaginable horror. Victor felt nothing. He forced himself to feel nothing. He was granite. He closed his eyes for a fraction of a second, consciously pushing the flicker of humanity away. It was a distraction, a vulnerability. He was a surgeon removing a tumor from the body of the state. The patient's fear was an irrelevant clinical detail. He looked at Pavel. "Connect the monitors. It is time to go." Pavel connected the final tubes and wires, then gently closed the trunk lid. It sealed with a heavy, final thud that seemed to suck the air from the warehouse. On his small monitor, a green light blinked steadily. Heart rate, 65. Respiration, 12. All nominal. Anatoly Levin, the physicist from Vienna, was gone. Package Epsilon was secure and ready for shipping. They abandoned the Mercedes in the warehouse. Dmitri would remain behind for 24 hours to wipe it clean of any forensic trace, down to the last stray hair, before melting back into the city's shadows. Victor and Pavel climbed into the Lada. The engine turned over with a rough, agricultural sputter. It sounded exactly like every other miserable Lada on the roads of the Eastern Bloc. It was perfect. Pavel navigated the pre-planned route out of Vienna, sticking to secondary roads, a varicose network of asphalt that snaked through sleeping villages and dark farmland, avoiding the Autobahn and its potential police patrols. Their destination was the border crossing at Drossenhofen, leading into the Czechoslovak Socialist Republic. They were not using diplomatic plates this time. The car was registered to a shell company, with papers identifying them as Czech factory representatives returning from a trade conference on industrial ball bearings. Their luggage in the back seat was filled with cheap corporate brochures, product samples, and expense receipts from a non-existent hotel. The tension in the car was a living entity. Every pair of headlights in the rearview mirror was a potential tail. Every police car parked by the side of the road sent a jolt of ice through their veins. Victor sat in the passenger seat, his Makarov PMM resting in a quick-draw holster in his lap, covered by a map. Its polymer grip was comforting against his palm. His gaze alternated between the road ahead and the steady, rhythmic blip on Pavel's monitor. That blip was their mission. If it stopped, they had failed. An hour into the drive, the monitor beeped softly, a warning tone. Levin's heart rate was climbing. 85, 95, 110. "He's panicking," Pavel whispered, his knuckles bone white on the steering wheel. "The paralytic is wearing off. He knows where he is. He can feel the motion." Victor didn't hesitate. He reached for the medical kit, taking out a small syringe of diazepam. He uncapped the sedation line, a small port accessible from under the rear passenger seat, and injected the drug smoothly into the IV tube. He watched the monitor. For a long, agonizing minute, the numbers stayed high. He could almost feel the silent, terrified struggle happening just a few feet behind him. Faint, muffled thumps against the fiberglass shell were barely audible over the road noise. But they were there, the frantic, desperate drumming of a man trying to beat his way out of his own grave. Then slowly, the heart rate began to fall. 100, 90, 80, back to a steady 70. The thumping stopped. "It is done," Victor said, his voice flat. They drove on in silence, the only sound the drone of the Lada's engine and the quiet, reassuring blink of the monitor. The border crossing at Drazenhofen appeared out of the darkness, a harsh island of sodium lights in the middle of the sleeping countryside. It was the Austrian side first. A young, bored-looking guard with adolescent acne waved them forward. "Guten Abend," he said, peering into the car. "Papiere, bitte." Pavel handed over the documents. The guard shone his flashlight into the back seat, illuminating the luggage and the stacks of brochures. He seemed satisfied. He glanced at their faces, two tired-looking men on a long drive home. He stamped their papers and waved them on with a lazy flick of his wrist. One down, they crossed the short stretch of no man's land, the road lined with coiled barbed wire and skeletal watchtowers, a stark reminder that they were leaving one world and entering another. The Czechoslovak checkpoint was more imposing. The guards here were not bored. They were suspicious by profession. They wore the grim, stony faces of men who believed in the sanctity of walls. A stern-faced officer with a thick mustache took their papers and studied them under the glare of the guardhouse light. He barked a few questions in Czech, which Pavel answered in a calm, steady voice. He explained their business, the conference, the long drive. It was a well-rehearsed, believable fiction. The officer grunted. He walked a slow, deliberate circle around the Lada, tapping the tires with his heavy boot. He stopped at the rear of the car. He stared at the trunk for a long, silent moment. Victor's own heart rate spiked. He could feel the blood pounding in his ears. He forced himself to remain perfectly still, his hands resting loosely in his lap. Any sign of tension would be a tell. "Otevřete kufr," the officer commanded. "Open the trunk." The three most feared words in their profession. Pavel's training took over. He didn't argue. He didn't show fear. He gave a weary sigh, the perfect impersonation of a man burdened by petty bureaucracy. "Samozřejmě," he said. "Of course." He got out of the car, took the keys from the ignition, and walked to the back. Victor's mind raced through the contingency plan, a desperate last resort. If Pavel was forced to open the trunk, he was to feign a problem with the lock, giving Victor a 3-second window. In those 3 seconds, Victor would have to kill both guards with his suppressed Makarov, and they would have to crash the barrier and vanish into the Czech night. It would be a catastrophic failure, a diplomatic incident, an aborted mission. Pavel fumbled with the key, his movements deliberately clumsy. He grunted in frustration. "It's stuck," he said in Czech, kicking the bumper lightly. "This piece of junk, it's always sticking." The officer's eyes narrowed. He stepped forward, ready to intervene. This was it. Victor's hand moved slowly towards the inside of his coat, his fingers brushing the cold steel of the suppressor. Suddenly, a loud shout came from the guardhouse. Another officer was waving frantically at them, pointing towards the road behind. A large articulated truck, its driver clearly drunk or asleep, was careening towards the checkpoint, swerving wildly across both lanes. Horns blared. The guards scrambled, their attention instantly diverted from the troublesome Lada to the immediate, tangible threat of a multi-ton vehicle about to demolish their post. The mustached officer swore, yelled at Pavel to get that piece of junk out of the way, and ran to help his comrades deploy a spike strip. Pavel didn't need to be told twice. He scrambled back into the driver's seat, turned the key, and floored the accelerator. The Lada shot through the now open barrier as the guards wrestled with the oncoming truck. They were through. For 10 kilometers, neither man spoke. Pavel drove with a ferocious intensity, putting as much distance as possible between them and the border. The silence was finally broken by a low, shaky laugh from Pavel. "The traffic god smiles upon us, Granite," he said, wiping a sheen of sweat from his forehead. Victor did not smile. "The center does not believe in gods," he said flatly. "That was luck. We will not be lucky again. Stick to the schedule." The rest of Czechoslovakia was a blur of dark forests and sleeping socialist towns. They drove through the night, stopping only once in a predetermined lay-by to refuel from jerry cans they carried in the back seat. To stop at a public petrol station was an unacceptable risk. While Pavel filled the tank, Victor checked on the package. He opened the trunk a crack, just enough to shine a pen light inside. Levin was sedated, his breathing shallow but even. The interior of the compartment was cool and dry. The system was working. He administered another small dose of sedative to ensure Levin would remain under for the next leg of the journey, and sealed the trunk again. They crossed into Poland near Ostrava, just as the false dawn was painting the eastern sky in shades of gray. This crossing was easier. The Poles were more concerned with people trying to get out than in. Their papers were barely glanced at. They were now deep inside the Warsaw Pact, a fish swimming in its home pond. But the danger was not over. The Polish security services, the Służba Bezpieczeństwa, were notoriously independent, and a Russian car driving across their country was still an object of curiosity. Their destination was a remote section of the Białowieża forest, a primeval wilderness that straddled the border between Poland and the Byelorussian SSR. Here, they were to perform a handoff. Driving the same car all the way to Moscow was too risky. The Lada and its 2 Czech occupants had to disappear. Following a complex set of directions based on landmarks, a leaning birch tree, a ruined chapel, a specific bend in a logging road. They arrived at the rendezvous point an hour after sunrise. It was a small, abandoned hunting lodge, deep in the woods, shrouded in a thick, damp mist that clung to the ancient trees. As they pulled up, a man emerged from the shadows of the lodge. He was tall, gaunt, and his eyes held the flat, lifeless look of a man who had seen too much. He was from the 8th Chief Directorate, the department responsible for internal communications and security. He was a professional cleaner. "Granite?" the man asked, his voice a low rasp, like stones grinding together. "I am Granite," Victor confirmed. "Is the transport ready?" The man nodded towards the back of the lodge. Parked there was a military UA's 452 van, a rugged, windowless vehicle painted in drab olive green, its sides splattered with mud. It looked like 1,000 other army vehicles that plied the roads of the Eastern Bloc. The transfer was performed with swift, silent efficiency. The new team, 2 men as grim and silent as the first, helped move Levin from the Lada's trunk to a similar, if cruder, hidden compartment inside the UAZ. Victor passed the monitoring device and the medical kit to the new team leader. "The package is stable," Victor said. "He requires sedation every 6 hours. Hydration is on a continuous drip. All systems are nominal." The new team leader, who did not give his name, grunted in acknowledgement. He didn't care about the details, only the objective. He and his partner climbed into the van. The engine roared to life, and without another word, the UAZ bumped down the forest track, heading east towards the final border, towards home. Victor and Pavel were left with the Lada and the tall, gaunt man. "Your work is finished," the man said. "The car will be disposed of. You will be given new papers. You will travel by train from Białystok to Warsaw, then fly from Warsaw to Sofia. From Sofia, you will return to Moscow by standard Aeroflot. You will not travel together. You will not speak of this again to anyone, not even to each other. He handed them each a packet containing a new passport, train tickets, and a wad of Polish zloty. Their old identities, the Czech factory reps, had ceased to exist. Pavel looked visibly relieved, the immense stress of the past 48 hours draining from his face. But Victor felt a strange emptiness. His part of the mechanism was done. The package was moving down the assembly line, and he was no longer attached to it. He had been a conduit for the will of the state, and now that will flowed through other men. He thought of Levin, lying in the dark, a prisoner of technology and geopolitics, hurtling towards his fate. He wondered what they would do to him in Moscow. The Lubyanka had rooms designed to dismantle a man's mind piece by piece. They would want the manuscript, of course. But more than that, they would want his soul. They would want a confession, a recantation, a public display of his brokenness to serve as a warning to others. The final border was Brest, the gateway to the Soviet Union. The team in the UAZ, led by a man known only as Volk or Wolf, watched the red and white striped barrier arm of the checkpoint loom in his windshield. His knuckles were white. The man beside him was rigid with tension. In the back, the package was silent, kept under by a heavy dose of sedative for this final, critical phase. A young lieutenant, his face pink and earnest with the zeal of a new posting, ordered them to pull over for a full inspection. This was unusual. Military transports were usually waved through with a cursory check of their transit orders. "Routine inspection, comrade," the lieutenant said, though there was nothing routine about his sharp, suspicious eyes. He was looking to make a name for himself. Volk handed over the papers. They were perfectly forged. Orders signed by a general in the Grodno military district, authorizing the transport of sensitive electronic equipment. The lieutenant read them slowly, then handed them back. "Open the back, comrade." "The cargo is classified," Volk said, his voice low and steady. "All the more reason for me to inspect it," the lieutenant retorted, a smirk playing on his lips. "To ensure it is secure." This was the moment, the point of catastrophic failure. Volk knew he had one card left to play, a card he had been instructed to use only in the most dire of circumstances. To use it was to expose the operation to another branch of the state, to create a paper trail that the center abhorred. He reached into his tunic and produced a slim, sealed envelope. It was marked only with a single, stamped letter, S, for Smerch. Special Operations, the personal seal of the deputy chairman of the KGB himself. He did not give it to the lieutenant. He held it out for the boy to see. "Comrade Lieutenant," Volk said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, "I suggest you contact your commanding officer. Tell him that an operation under the personal authority of Directorate S is at this checkpoint. Tell him that any delay will be noted in my report. A report that will be on the deputy chairman's desk by morning." The young lieutenant's face went pale. The smirk vanished, replaced by a mask of pure, unadulterated fear. Directorate S was a phantom, a ghost story told in whispers in the barracks. To interfere with them was not just a career-ending mistake. It was a life-ending one. He could see his entire future, his career, his comfortable posting, his very freedom, evaporating in the cold glare of the man in the van. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. He snapped to attention, saluted crisply, and waved them through. "My apologies, comrade. Proceed. Glory to the motherland." The UAZ rolled past the red star of the Soviet Union, leaving the last checkpoint behind. They were home, The journey ended not at the dreaded Lubyanka prison in Dzerzhinsky Square, but at a secluded dacha nestled in the silver birch forests west of Moscow. It was a place that did not officially exist, one of dozens of safe houses and black sites scattered around the capital. When the rear doors of the UAZ were opened, Victor was there, waiting. He had been recalled from his circuitous route home by a coded message in Sofia. The colonel wanted him present for the delivery. Levin was pulled from his confinement. After nearly 3 days in the dark, he was a wreck. His beard was matted, his eyes were wild and unfocused, and he could not stand on his own. He stumbled, supported by 2 guards, blinking in the harsh light, a man ripped from one reality and thrust into another. The colonel stepped out from the dacha. He was a small, unassuming man in a simple gray suit, the kind of man you would never notice in a crowd. But his eyes held a weight, an ancient reptilian intelligence that missed nothing. He was the mind, and men like Victor and Volk were merely his hands. He looked at the broken form of Anatoly Levin, not with triumph or anger, but with a strange, almost paternal disappointment. "Anatoly Sergeyevich," the colonel said, his voice surprisingly soft. "Welcome home." Levin stared at him, his mind still struggling to piece together the nightmare. The colonel turned to Volk and his team. "Your work is exemplary. You are dismissed." He then looked at Victor. "Walk with me, Granite." They walked along a gravel path, away from the dacha, the scent of pine needles sharp in the air. The mission was a success, the colonel stated. It was not a question. "Yes, Comrade Colonel," Victor replied. "Levin's manuscript," the colonel continued, "is a work of genius. Its analysis of the systemic decay, the spiritual rot. It is flawless. He sees the cracks in the foundation with more clarity than anyone in the Politburo." Victor was stunned into silence. This was not what he had expected. "His mistake," the colonel said, stopping to look Victor in the eye, "was not in the writing. It was in the publishing. He chose to give this weapon to our enemies, to let them use our own truths against us. He is a fool, a romantic. He believes the system must be torn down from the outside." The colonel smiled, a thin, bloodless expression. "He is wrong. The system cannot be torn down, but it can be changed, steered, from the inside, his analysis, his roadmap of our weaknesses. In the right hands, it is not a weapon against us. It is a blueprint for repair, a tool for the next generation of leadership." The truth landed on Victor with the force of a physical blow.